Thank you, Angela. And thanks everyone for this really fabulous conversation. Before I say anything myself, I just want to support a number of things that all of you have said, beginning with Jesse, on making a very simple case for why is this important, because what we see in the news media is misrepresentation, lack of context and knowledge. And is there a way for us to create a space where people can tell their own stories? Because clearly we have demonstrated an inability to do it on behalf of other communities. And then to obviously Nadia and Anita's points on changing the infrastructure and in changing the culture of the people who are making decisions right now. I think this is such a key point, because even where there is in some newsrooms the capacity or the desire to make change, some of it is stymied because the people higher up on top don't understand or don't want to accept or are in denial about the real problems that exist. And then to Bethlehem's point, which I think is really, I've heard this numerous times before, there is this sense that you will get hired as a person of color or as a Black person, Indigenous person, but don't question the way in which this story is being done. The minute you start participating actively with a different way in which the story should be approached or framed, you're shut down. And I think that those things are, certainly in CJOC, thanks to Anita and Sadia, we're seeing a lot of those conversations happening right now. People are talking about what it feels like to consistently being shut down when you have really powerful and important stories, because the status quo doesn't see it or doesn't want to see it. So I'll start with just saying one really quick thing. It's really interesting to me that what is happening in the US has instigated a conversation in Canada, as if we always need something to happen from outside, from the US, for it to resonate, even though we had a TRC, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and all of those recommendations were in place in 2015, and not much happened. So that's an interesting power dynamic that I think is important to establish. And I think I'll just sort of follow that up with saying that there is a true resistance in Canada to address this question of equity, because I think you have to process out from out of the space of just media and media organizations, because I think Canadian kids growing up in Canada grow up from day one fed on this kind of diet of multiculturalism and peacekeeping. And I think, this kind of noble ideas create this sense of, superiority. Canadians know it themselves. They talk about multiculturalism in this way. They travel overseas and people say, oh, you're Canadian and you're so good and you're so, and this kind of culture gets kind of instilled in one's sense of being, which I think makes it a lot harder to have some of these conversations about what is actually the problem and why, how are we complicit in it. So I do want to say that I'll place myself in this context. I'm an immigrant myself and a settler to this country. And I'm deeply conscious of that location. And I think I'm also recognize that people are not always comfortable with new arrivals being critical of age-old practices. But I do see some of the problems in the landscape, and I see it also through the eyes of my children, who I see as going through the education system, and I see what they're learning. And I think, we're talking about COVID and some of the challenges of COVID, the COVID reality. One of the bonuses or pluses has been that, and I'm sure many other parents may feel this way, that we're more deeply exposed to the curriculum our children are learning in school. And I am seeing stuff on pioneer villages and pioneer communities that looks like it's been printed in 1973 or something. I'm just off the top of my head. That hasn't changed. And so all of the accompanying curriculum on these really key issues. So, students are doing social science projects in grade 4 and 5 on indigenous communities, pick a community, what do people eat, how do they live? It looks like a 1898 anthropology of the peoples of Canada or something. So, you know, the people who occupy positions of power in newsrooms, they've all gone through the same system, right? And everyone's built on the same foundation of knowledge. And that part of the problem is it's not just Canadian media, it is the whole system that is the problem. And we have to go much deeper than just address hiring practices. And that's one aspect of a much deeper and much more difficult problem to address. So some of the work that I've done with my colleague, sorry, I've gone all over the place with this question, Angela, but Asma Malik is one of my colleagues, and she and I and Davide Mastracci have been doing some work on looking at representation in Canadian media. And Anita, you'd mentioned that there isn't a really rich landscape of information and insight on what that looks like. And we're not the first people to try that work. This work has been done by 4 or 5 different groups of people over time. But we decided, why go to media organization? Let's just look at what already exists in the public landscape. So we decided to look at opinion writers at the 3 major Canadian national publications, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Toronto Star, which is pretty much has that kind of national reach, I think. And opinion columnists are interesting because they use their own words to describe themselves. So they self-identify without being asked to self-identify, right? I as a white male, I as a woman, I as a middle-aged person. So they were really easy for us to pick out that information from their own language and words without us having to go to media organizations. But we were also recognizing that opinion is a really interesting space, because you can say it's not journalism, but the public doesn't necessarily always have a clear sense of what is opinion and what is journalism. And as an editorial organization, you are giving real estate to certain people to expand their voices and expand their arguments. And so there is a very strong editorial commitment, I think, in the creation of opinion space for opinion. So we looked at, so based on our research, what we saw was, you know, not at all surprising. There hasn't been a single full-time Indigenous columnist in Canada. You know, there are 3 Black male columnists over a period of time, and we know what happened to Desmond Cole. So the results speak for themselves. What we wanted to do was make a case for the importance of doing this work, because when you see the numbers, you can see the problem. And it's not as if this is going to resolve the problem entirely, but I think it's a very important step. And I think Nadia and Anita would agree, because it was one of the first, I think it's the first call to action, is it not, is to start doing this work. Sorry, how much time do I have left? Just so I'm, okay. Okay, so I think the very important thing is it's when it comes to news, it's not just who makes the decisions. It's just as important whose byline is on, right? So this is a wholesale thing that we need to be looking at in a much more constructive way. But I think the point is that having this kind of information or data gives us a place to start. And that place is fundamental. It's really important in the media landscape, because you know, if you recognize media, this is speaking a little bit to Anita's point about civic responsibility. It's also really important because the media sees itself as a 4th estate, and it may also explain why it's so reluctant. There's very little organizations or sectors that have this kind of sense of a moral high horse that the media has, because it has this power to look at others and to tell others what they're doing wrong or what they're doing right. So the sense of power, I think, is often abused, and I think that but it also sets up a really major problem because you look at media as the fourth estate, but then the fourth estate itself is so deeply problematic that it's not doing that hard work of analyzing who is in its ranks and how to address that problem. How is that organization then going to report on the rest of society? So you see, there's a fundamental structural problem with the issue to begin with. And so, you know, we keep throwing around these terms, the fourth estate, public interest. And I think what we are seeing is that the hidden burden of responding to this issue is consistently placed on the shoulders of either racialized journalists or, you know, organizations that have existed. And I would love to hear Nadia talk a little bit about this, because CJOC is pretty new in this space, but CABJ has been around for a long time. So I'm really interested in hearing about how that cultural reality has changed to respond to those, and how difficult the climb has been to get to here. And this kind of just supports what Nadia was saying earlier, which is none of this is terribly revolutionary. You know, the people have been trying to have this, to talk about these issues for a very, very long time. And I think there is a real power at this moment, but I think it's really important to recognize the people who have been working for a very long time and quietly dealing with the micro and macro aggressions that they've had to suffer within the newsroom. And then a last point I just want to make is that this is not just, I mean, I talked earlier about how it's a systemic, deeper problem. So this is not just about media organizations, it's about the journalism schools that send students out trained and ready to join that workforce. It's also about high schools. I think a lot of high schools that have newspapers or some form of like broadcasting where students get training tend to be in communities that are communities where, you know, are where there's more privilege, where there's more access, and less representation of racialized communities. And so what you have is the young people who have the capacity and ability to participate in conversations that are of public interest, that will move the pendulum on policy and those kinds of things, and whose personal life experience speaks to that, are not making their way to journalism school. And and I think that's something we need to think about both at journalism schools, like how do we reach out and develop more programs that will provide access. And I think CABJ is doing that in Halifax right now. So I'll end with that. I do want to talk at some other stage if there's an opportunity about new ways of doing journalism, but back at you, Angela, with this multitude of comments.